Funding for Treasuring Our Natural Heritage has been provided by the National Science Foundation. From space, from the perspective of astronauts, the Earth stands out as a precious sunlit jewel. Its great swirls of blue and white announce that this is a living planet, an outpost of biological life in the vast, dark expanse of the universe. The richness of biological life on Earth is truly astounding. Over the millennia, organisms have adapted in wondrous ways to transform the rocky mantle of our planet into a magnificent tapestry of life. To date, some 1.5 million species of plants, animals, and microorganisms have been identified. Yet this represents only a fraction of all the species on Earth. Scientists estimate that the true number ranges from about 7 million to as many as 100 million. This vast multitude of species constitutes the biological diversity, or biodiversity, of the Earth. Biodiversity includes all of the plant, animal, and microbial species and the genetic variation within each of them, as well as all of the habitats in which these species live. Looking at this awesome spectacle, this intricate web of planetary life, people often wonder why there are so many different species. Reacting to reports about the continuing loss of plant and animal species around the world, they wonder how much biological diversity is necessary to safeguard the health of our planet and to ensure the well-being of our own species. These are critical questions, both for humanity and for the Earth, and we will explore them over the course of the series. In this program, we'll look closely at the web of biological life. We'll examine the deep bonds that link all living things, and we'll listen to leading researchers as they reveal the latest scientific thinking about biological diversity and the role it plays in maintaining the long-term health of our planet. To appreciate the importance of biological diversity, it is first necessary to understand some basic principles of nature. And a good way to do that is to compare the natural world with something more familiar, the human economy in which we live and work. Yvonne Baskin is a science writer who has used this analogy in her own books and articles about the natural world.
There are many ways to think about how to appreciate nature, how to better understand nature, and they all work differently for different people. For some, it's very much a spiritual connection with nature. For others, it's a focus on the beauty of nature. For me, because I'm trying to explain how nature works, it's often very useful to think of analogies, and one way to think about the sorts of bonds that bring plants and animals together in a community is to think about them as economic bonds, very much like the economic bonds that bring human communities together. If that analogy seems strange, think about what an economy is. It's simply a system for producing and distributing and consuming goods or wealth. Well, what would a plant or animal out in the natural world think of as wealth? You can think of it in two different currencies, and both of them are vital for life. One is energy and the other one is nutrients. Energy is available in unlimited supply from sunlight, but it can't be put into play in the natural economy until it's converted into a usable form by plants. The other form of currency is nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, and these are limited in any given habitat, and so they have to be continuously recycled, released by the forces of rot and decay, and made available for the next generation. Just like us, every plant and animal and microbe out here has to make a living, and that means it has to use whatever aptitudes and skills it has to obtain the two basic currencies, energy and nutrients. You can think of the strategies that all these creatures use as occupations. Green plants have taken the occupation of producers. Animals are consumers. They either prey on plants or they prey on other animals. Some animals and lots of microbes do the work of decomposing. So as all these creatures go about the business of making a living, they unwittingly exchange a wide range of what we could think of as goods and services. As a creature moves around its habitat, feeding itself, caring for its young, excreting wastes, it necessarily creates opportunities for other creatures, ones that can prey on it or use what it produces or what it leaves behind. And it's quite easy to think of this continuous interchange that's created as a local economy. Just like the human economy, the economies of natural communities are dynamic. They're always subject to change. Plants and animals may occasionally have to adapt their occupational strategies just to survive in changing conditions. And sometimes species are swept aside by a competitor, much the same way that human workers or even whole industries can be swept aside by competitive forces or when market situations change. If we take a broader view of the landscape, from the meadow here to the lodgepole pine forests, even out to the sagebrush steppe beyond, we can see that there's a vast web of commerce between species that actually links together the life of the whole region and ultimately sustains the vitality and productivity of the earth.
The work of nature can be observed in any natural habitat, including the sagebrush steppe, the high desert landscape that is found widely throughout the American West. In the sagebrush steppe, plants, together with the soils in which they grow, represent the foundation of the economy. In fact, plants are the primary producers of the natural world. That's true in almost all types of habitat, from high deserts to tropical savannas, and from prairies to alpine forests. That's because the occupational skills of plants enable them to acquire the two basic currencies of nature. They can gather nutrients from the soil and energy from sunlight. Many different kinds of plants have adapted to life in the sagebrush steppe, and sagebrush communities can be very rich and biologically productive, even ones located in urban areas, such as this site near downtown Boise, just a short distance from the Idaho state capital.
I really enjoy walking through the sagebrush steppe. I really see a lot of diversity of life, small animals and plants, and even here right near the Capitol.
Roger Rosentreter is a plant ecologist with the U.S. Bureau of Land Management. He knows the plants of the sagebrush steppe from years of careful observation.
This sagebrush steppe community is a very rich community. It has dozens and dozens of species. All these different species are able to coexist because they each fill a little different occupational niche.
The dominant plant of the sagebrush steppe is, of course, sagebrush. Because of its size, it lends structure to the habitat and provides a basic spatial organization. Other plants fill in the spaces between the large shrubs. With its deep roots, sagebrush could be described as the hydraulic engineer of the steppe community.
One of the very interesting occupational attributes of sagebrush is its ability to pump water from the soil. And in this way it functions as a hydraulic engineer, bringing moisture from deep in the soil close to the surface. There are a number of plants, such as this grass, that can benefit from the moisture that is pumped up by the sagebrush. These sagebrush islands within the sagebrush steppe community also act as physical barriers to the wind, providing shelter for many animals and collecting nutrients that are blown around as dust. And in the winter, they act as a snow fence and collect and capture snow, which adds to the moisture and fertility of these islands of sagebrush. Sagebrush is critical for most of the animals in the sagebrush steppe. What we're looking at here in sagebrush is actually housing for some species and food for other species. Deer, pronghorn antelope, and sage grouse are dependent on sagebrush for food.
Bunch grasses are another important type of plant found throughout the sagebrush steppe. The many species of bunch grasses use a somewhat different array of occupational skills to make their living in the arid desert environment.
Viewed from the perspective of the human economy, bunch grasses are the steady, dependable workers. They build a strong foundation. They do this because they take the sun's energy and they put some of it into biomass of the leaves, but they take a portion of it and reinvest that energy or capital into the root system. In lean years, bunch grasses are able to borrow from their capital to be productive despite the weather conditions. This helps even out the ups and downs of the local natural economy.
If sagebrush and bunch grasses can be described as the steady, dependable workers of the sagebrush community, then annual flowering plants, or forbs, are the seasonal workers. These plants go to work only when moisture levels and temperatures are just right.
We call them seasonal workers because when conditions are favorable, they'll work overtime and produce a lot of above-ground mass. Unlike bunch grasses, they do not store away any reserve in a root system in a sort of savings account. This leads to a boom and bust cycle. In wet years, we have a boom of this plant, and in dry years, we have a bust or very few plants that are produced.
Looking closely at this site, it's possible to see that not all of the plants are true natives. Some, such as cheatgrass, are alien species that have invaded the area. Although cheatgrass is a nuisance plant that causes major problems in areas where it becomes established, it nevertheless illustrates a fundamental principle of the natural world, that forces of competition and natural selection regularly alter the composition of the workforce. Invasive change of this sort is yet another sign that natural economies are highly dynamic.
This is a very good example of a change in the biological workforce, and it shows that there is no more job security in the natural economy than there is in the human economy.
While individual plant species play important roles and occupy distinctive niches, there is an entire community of organisms that is vital to the health of most desert habitats. the community is called biological soil crust, or microbiotic crust, and it is found in deserts across the world. David Evans is a soil ecologist from the University of Arkansas who is studying biological soil crust in the canyonlands of Utah.
Now, the biological soil crust is very inconspicuous during the summer because the organisms are dormant. They need water to regain activity. For example, this is a patch of biological soil crust, and it's very inconspicuous to most people. But what I'd like you to see is the transformation that occurs once we apply water. And now you can start to see the different components of the biological soil crust. For example, you can see the green here as the mosses regain activity, and the black irregular shape here is the cyanobacteria.
Biological soil crust can be found in several different varieties in desert habitats throughout the American West. Typically, the crust community contains over 100 different microscopic species, including diatoms, algae, fungi, and bacteria, as well as larger organisms such as mosses and lichens that are readily visible on the surface. Of the many bacteria that are present, the microscopic cyanobacteria have a particularly important occupational role.
They're capable of a process called nitrogen fixation. The cyanobacteria contain a special enzyme that allows them to take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into a form that's actually useful for the other plants and the animals within this habitat. It's nitrogen fixation by this cyanobacteria that's providing the fertilizer that these plants use to grow, and then ultimately the animals will use for their metabolism. Now, based on the research that my colleagues and I have done in Arches and Canyonlands National Park, we know that the biological soil crust represents the dominant source of nitrogen input into this arid habitat.
Like humans, organisms often perform multiple occupational functions within their communities, and that's certainly true of the biological soil crust. In addition to fixing nitrogen, the crust also helps retain precious nutrients, especially water.
Soil crusts are also very important for keeping resources local. And what I mean by that is that when it rains, without something to stop the rainfall, it just runs off to the nearest river. With the presence of soil crusts, that water instead soaks in and makes the water available locally to plants.
Jane Belknap is a research ecologist who specializes in the study and conservation of desert habitats. She points out that the biological crust also plays a critical role in stabilizing fragile desert soils.
If you think about it, deserts are made up mostly of sand. Sand particles have no mechanism by which to hold together. And so without something like a soil crust to stabilize them, they just blow around when the wind comes along. This is a big problem, because what you're losing is the soil fertility in your system. And when the wind comes along and blows those fine particles away, what you're losing are all the nutrients that help the plants grow. What these soil crusts do is connect each sand grain together, literally linking them like pop beads on a chain. And then when the wind comes along or water comes along, it's very hard for them to move because there's now a much larger aggregate to move rather than individual sand grains. So soil crusts are essentially providing a cap on desert soil surfaces.
Plants are the primary producers of the natural world, and they support a vast array of consumers. The first tier of consumers includes plant-eating animals, also known as herbivores. These animals, like the plants themselves, have specific occupational roles and places of work. Herbivores make their living by gathering energy and nutrients from plants. A good example is the pika, a diminutive relative of rabbits. Seen from an occupational perspective, this small mammal could be described as a hay farmer.
Pikas could be thought of as hay farmers because the way they get through winter is by harvesting plants during the growing season when they're more abundant and of higher nutritional quality, and caching them in what are called hay piles.
Nancy Huntley is a community ecologist at Idaho State University. She has spent years studying pikas at a variety of locations throughout the Intermountain West, including this site in the Sawtooth Mountains of Idaho.
Pikas live on talus slopes, which are boulder fields, scree fields, long runs of rock in which they shelter and in which they store their hay. They're active year-round, so they don't hibernate or cut their metabolic rate in any way in winter, and their needs stay high when the plants aren't available. To do that, they have to be able to select plants that will supply the proteins they need, and they have to also find a way of storing plants to get through winter, so they're little harvesters. This is one pika's hay pile, and it's an animal that's only recently begun collecting hay for this winter. The green plant material here on the top is mostly Vaccinium huckleberry that's just been collected this year. You could think of the hay piles of pikas as a savings account in which at times when they're capable of earning a living very well, when the season is warm and plants are up and growing, they harvest more than they need. And they keep what they don't need to consume at the time in these hay piles, which are then the bank account they can draw on during winter.
Most winters, pikas do not consume all the vegetation they harvest. What's left becomes highly valuable as compost.
Underneath the hay that's been collected this year, you can see bits and pieces of plant material that weren't consumed over the winter. These are what contribute to decomposition and local enrichment of soils.
The relationship between herbivores and plants is not as one-sided as it might seem. While plant-eating animals consume vegetation, they also provide services that are valuable to plants. In this way, their relationships can be viewed as mutually advantageous. The hummingbird provides a good example. Although hummingbirds are not exclusively herbivorous, they nevertheless play an important role in pollinating scarlet gilia. In the process of gathering nectar from the plant's trumpet-like flowers, hummingbirds transport pollen from one plant to another, thus helping pollinate the gilia. Without this service, it would not be able to reproduce and survive. Pronghorn antelope, elk, and other ungulates also take part in the ongoing exchange between herbivores and plants. When they eat grasses and sagebrush leaves, they produce dung, which in turn serves as fertilizer for a number of plant species. This pattern of exchange between organisms is repeated in millions of different transactions throughout the sagebrush community. The network of exchange between the many species that live and work in any particular habitat can be thought of as a local economy. Within these local economies, species are highly interdependent.
In any community or local economy like this one, you find species interacting and depending on one another in all sorts of obvious and also very subtle ways.
Gretchen Daly is a research scientist who has studied a fascinating web of commerce centered around one particular kind of woodpecker, the red-naped sapsucker. Daly has closely observed the behavior of sapsuckers in aspen groves at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory near Crested Butte, Colorado. In terms of occupation, red-naped sapsuckers can be compared with human workers who collect syrup from maple trees, workers such as the sap tappers of New England.
When the sapsuckers first start working on a willow shrub, they develop these small exploratory wells, just a few millimeters across, and they do these all over the place. Just about every willow stem in this valley has exploratory wells in it. After drilling perhaps hundreds or even thousands of these exploratory wells, the sapsuckers then decide on a few of those to develop into major wells like this one. And you can see the sapsucker works away at the top of the well, creating this bearded part that helps to wick out the sap. And only the sapsucker is able to do this. None of the other species that feed on the wells help to create or maintain the production of sap flow.
During the nesting season, adult sapsuckers carry on a lively traffic between their nest holes and the nearby willow thickets.
So this is a really busy time for the adult sapsuckers. The young are getting big and really hungry, and the adults are away most of the day shopping around for food to bring back to the hungry babies. And they'll collect a bunch of insects, then they'll go to the wells and they'll sweep the insects into the sap, making a nice little granola bar and bundle that they bring back and deliver to the nestlings. So the nestlings are lucky. They sit there mostly getting little granola bar deliveries all day.
Many other species in the local economy depend on sugar from the sap wells. Butterflies, wasps, beetles, flies, hummingbirds, squirrels, and a host of other creatures rely on the willow sap for nutrition at certain times of year.
By zeroing in on one species, like the sapsucker, and looking at all the others with which it interacts, one sees how complicated some of these webs of interaction are. So with the sapsucker, for instance, we found it benefiting about 40 different species that you'll find commonly feeding on the wells during the day.
There is still more evidence of interdependence to be observed in the life of the red-naped sapsucker. When it comes time for sapsuckers to build their nests, they look for aspen trees that are infected with a fungus known as heartwood or heart rot fungus. The fungus actually plays a critical role in the nest building process because it softens the wood enough for the birds to be able to drill out a nest cavity.
Only about 10 or 20% of the trees around here have actually been rotted out for the sapsucker by this special heartwood fungus. The sapsucker has to go around testing different trees. They don't want to go for a totally rotted tree or the thing will fall apart or a predator might easily be able to pull away the outer bark and get at their nestlings. So they want a nice strong tree that's just been partially rotted by this heartwood fungus. Once they make this cavity, they rear their young in it for one season, and then in the next year, they come out and repeat the whole cycle, going for a nice, fresh, new nest.
The abandoned sapsucker nests become prime housing for other species of birds that live in the aspen forest community.
Just right here in this little neighborhood in the valley here, there are about 7 other species of bird that don't have the right kind of head structure and the strong chisel-like beak and the musculature to build their own house. So they depend on the sapsucker for their housing.
The birds that rely on abandoned sapsucker nests include the violet-green swallow, the tree swallow, the mountain bluebird, the house wren, and 2 types of chickadees, the mountain chickadee and the black-capped chickadee. As we have seen, the web of commerce surrounding the red-naped sapsucker in this mountain community includes willow shrubs, aspen trees, heart rot fungus, many species of insects, several small mammals, and a number of bird species. And if we were to look even more closely, we would discover that the circle of interdependence is larger still. Within the larger pattern of interdependence found in any natural community, there's also a great deal of competition for food resources, just as there is in the human economy. In desert habitats, for example, seed gatherers, such as these night-foraging kangaroo rats, must compete with other animals for the limited availability of goods.
Studying the economy of seeds perhaps provides some of the best parallels between the economy of nature and human economies. Here we see very strong evidence of an economy that's based on healthy competition.
Jim Brown is a community ecologist from the University of New Mexico. He's been studying the competition between seed-gathering animals at this research site in the Chihuahuan Desert of Arizona for more than 2 decades.
Seeds play a major role in the economy of deserts. Presumably this is because seeds are almost continuously available in the soil. There are several groups of animals that feed primarily on seeds and compete for them. the rodents, the harvester ants, the seed-eating birds.
It's Merriam's kangaroo rat.
Kangaroo rats are the most dominant of the seed-eating rodents at the research site. To get a better understanding of the kangaroo rat's impact on their principal rivals, the pocket mice, Brown and his assistants tried removing the kangaroo rats from an experimental plot.
When we do that, we find that the abundances of pocket mice typically increase somewhere between 2 and as much as 10 times the densities that we observe on control plots where kangaroo rats are present.
Jim Brown has also investigated the competitive relationship between kangaroo rats and harvester ants. Although the ants are much smaller, the competition is nevertheless very real.
We were able to show the interaction between the rodents and harvester ants particularly clearly in earlier studies in the Sonoran Desert. Where we removed rodents, we got about a 2-fold increase in the abundance of harvester ants. And when we removed harvester ants, we also got about a 50% increase in rodent populations.
Brown's research is interesting in yet another way. His studies of the competitive relationships between seed-gathering animals show that food resources tend to be fully utilized. Thus, while the fortunes of individual consumers may ebb and flow, total consumption remains more or less constant.
There appears to be an economy of relatively constant consumption. Different species of consumers, the different species of rodents increase and decrease in their abundance, but the overall effect is still to have all of the seeds utilized.
Virtually nothing is wasted in the natural economy. Even the carcasses of dead animals become food resources for enterprising species. Species such as these burying beetles.
The burying beetle is really aptly named because of its role in nature, which is to bury dead animals. So in that sense, it's very similar to the human role of the undertaker. And in this case, the ecological reason that these beetles are burying dead animals is to use the nutrients that are in the dead animal as food for their offspring.
Rosemary Smith is a behavioral ecologist who has made a study of burying beetles. She says that among the burying beetle's occupational skills is a highly refined sense of smell. The beetles are able to detect very subtle odors emanating from the bodies of freshly deceased small mammals, even at a great distance.
This isn't the smell that we smell when something is dead. When we smell something that's dead, it's really strong, and generally it's been dead several days. This is the smell that really only these beetles can detect. They can smell something that's dead within an hour or 2 of its death. You can see the structures that they use to detect the smells by the very large sort of balls at the end of their antennae. And in some species, these balls are orange. They're called clubs, actually.
Once the beetles have found a carcass, they bury it as quickly as possible, either by excavating a hole or by using an existing crevice. Rapid burying is essential to prevent larger, more powerful scavengers, such as vultures and coyotes, from spotting the prize and stealing it from the beetles.
When the beetles need to move the mouse body to an existing hole, what they'll do is they'll crawl underneath the carcass and on their backs put their legs up touching the carcass and heave the carcass with all 6 of their legs. And then they'll crawl around to the front of the carcass and do this again. And through that process, they can move the carcass several meters. When the beetle gets to the edge of a hole, if it's just a single beetle, again, they will be underneath the carcass and using their legs to lift the carcass and drop it into the hole. And a single beetle can do this. And they're actually really strong for their size, and they can hoist the mouse and just allow it to fall into the hole. And at that point, then they can start the final stage, which is the preparation of the carcass for their offspring to be able to feed on.
Once the dead rodent is safely underground, the beetles employ a variety of techniques to keep the meat fresh. Using special salivary glands, they continually coat the body with an antimicrobial chemical that kills both bacteria and fungi.
Another interesting feature of these beetles, unlike other insects, is they have extended parental care. That is, they're keeping this resource going in good condition for their offspring for several weeks.
There's another interesting relationship, what scientists call a mutualism, that can be observed in the underground burial chamber. It occurs between the beetles and small mites, many of which can be seen clinging to the female beetle.
And you might think that, oh, this is some horrible parasite or some awful creature. But in fact, the mites are performing a beneficial role. They're mutualists with the beetles. What they're doing is that they are piercing any remaining fly eggs that may have been on the carcass when it was buried.
In mutualistic relationships, both species profit. Here, the beetles benefit from the removal of fly maggots that would compete for the carrion, and the mites benefit by getting a free ride on their beetle hosts as they move from one carcass to another. This gives the mites a valuable opportunity to meet other non-related mites with whom they can breed.
Another important role of these beetles, of course, is the fact that they are reusing the material that was collected in the bodies of the living mice. These burying beetles are an integral part of that recycling of the materials from a living animal to another living animal.
If plant-eating animals are the primary consumers in the natural economy, then predatory animals represent a second tier of consumption. Each predator hunts and makes its living by deriving energy and nutrients from an animal prey. This horned lizard has discovered an ant mound, and along with it, a tasty meal of harvester ants. Predatory species may themselves be consumed by larger and more powerful predators. Here, a lizard has fallen prey to a pygmy owl. As one predator consumes another, biological capital is distributed throughout the food chain. Thus, a trout that grows large by feeding on insects may later become the fuel that powers one of nature's most majestic hunters, the bald eagle. Human beings are the dominant species in the natural web of commerce, and we have an interest in virtually every level of the food chain. While consuming fish, fowl, and a wide variety of meats, we also eat fruits and grains and vegetables. In addition, we power our vehicles with fossil fuels. We use wood and other natural materials to build our homes, and we derive many of our medicines from plant sources. All this gives us a vital stake in the health and productivity of the plants that form the base of the food chain. But what factors make plant communities productive? And how can that natural productivity be maintained over time? As we saw earlier in the program, plants are the primary producers of the natural world. All productivity arises from their remarkable ability to trade in the two essential currencies of life, energy and nutrients. The extent to which plants can make a living in a particular habitat will depend on a number of physical factors. There must be sufficient sunlight and water, of course, and the soil must contain enough nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients to support plant growth. Productive local economies are those in which there is sufficient energy and nutrients for plants to grow and reproduce and create biological capital through their root structure and above-ground mass. From a biological standpoint, productivity of this kind is not limited to tropical and temperate areas. Desert habitats are also highly productive in biological terms. There's another factor that many scientists consider vital to the ongoing health and productivity of plant communities. It's the number of species present in those communities. That is, their biological diversity. The importance of plant diversity has been demonstrated in the research of Jim Brown, the community ecologist who was seen earlier in the program. Brown has been studying a remote desert site near Portal, Arizona for more than 20 years. Over that time, there has been a wide variation in rainfall, from extreme droughts to relatively wet years.
The economy of deserts is dictated primarily by the effects of the most important limiting resource, which of course is water. The water comes to the desert in rainfall. The rains are sporadic and highly unpredictable. Then the moisture is rapidly taken up and utilized by a variety of different kinds of desert plants. Of particular importance are the annuals. Here on the study site, the annuals account for about 2/3 of the approximately 130-some plant species that we have recorded.
In his study of desert plants at the Portal site, Brown has discovered that despite wide variation in yearly rainfall, almost every year has been highly productive for at least one species of annual plants.
In our long-term study, one of the things that we've found is that we tend to have a different plant species, or sometimes 2 or 3 different plant species, dominating almost every year. Now, when you consider that we've been working for more than 22 years now, that's a lot of different plant species.
What's especially striking about Brown's findings is that entirely different annuals dominate from one year to the next. Why this wide variation? The reason, says Brown, is that each plant species has its own suite of adaptations, and different species are able to capitalize on the changing conditions from year to year.
Different ones of these species, typically 1 or 2 or 3 per season, are able to use that unique combination of conditions, dominate, and maintain high productivity.
Brown's findings demonstrate a strong relationship between the community's plant diversity and its continued productivity. They also show that the many different plants are able to coexist because they have somewhat different occupational strategies and niches.
This site shows some of the relationships between diversity and productivity. Each annual species appears to have very precise requirements for germination and for availability of water through the season as it matures. Some of them, for example, germinate early in the fall in October with the first rains. Other species delay germination until spring rains. If the rains come early, some of the larger seeded species tend to be more abundant. When the rains come late in the spring, some of the small seeded species, such as Cryptantha and Stephanomeria, tend to be more abundant.
With the high diversity of plants and their many different adaptations, the health and productivity of the site have remained relatively constant over the years.
One of the most interesting features of the system that we've noticed relatively recently is its extreme long-term stability. Over time, as environmental conditions have changed, different plant and animal species have increased in abundance to take advantage of those conditions, while other species have decreased. But overall, productivity, species diversity, and the abundance of most of the key animal and plant groups have remained relatively constant.
Brown's research raises an intriguing question. If the diverse plant species all contribute to the stability of the local economy, which species, if any, could be lost without endangering the long-term health of that economy? The answer is that we simply don't know, not at the present time anyway. What's more, we might never have enough scientific knowledge to answer that question in a definitive way. That's because natural systems are incredibly complex. What's more, the special talents of particular plants might not be noticed except under highly unusual conditions.
This is plot 7-2.
One species may be especially resistant to prolonged drought, for example, while another may be able to withstand diseases that devastate other members of the community. In a way, then, biological diversity can be seen as a kind of natural insurance policy, giving communities the greatest number of resources for adapting to environmental changes over time.
One way to think about biological diversity is as an insurance policy. Ecosystems that are more diverse are going to be more predictable. They're going to continue to function year after year after year, because every year there'll be in them some species that are able to handle whatever curveball nature is throwing them that year.
David Tillman is a community ecologist at the University of Minnesota. His research appears to confirm the insurance value of biological diversity.
Well, this is what, an 8-species plot it looks like. So what are you finding out here?
Since 1982, Tillman has been studying the links between diversity and productivity in a habitat hundreds of miles away from the desert locale being studied by Jim Brown. Tillman is doing his research in a prairie grassland habitat north of Minneapolis. Working at the University of Minnesota's Cedar Creek Research Station, he is attempting to document the effects of habitat simplification brought about by the conversion of prairie to agriculture.
So what's the treatment for this plot? Once were very diverse prairies, hundreds of species of plants living together in these ecosystems now tend to be one species of plant, corn or soybean or something else being farmed. Well, we're interested in what effect that kind of simplification, that loss of diversity has on the functioning of these ecosystems. And so we've set up here a series of experiments in which we control diversity. And by controlling diversity in our experiments, by controlling the number of prairie plants living in a plot, we're able to find out what the effect of human simplification has been on the functioning of Minnesota ecosystems.
Over the years, Tillman and his colleagues have laid out a great many individual plots featuring different numbers and combinations of native plants.
In this experiment, we set up 147 different plots. 20 of them are monocultures, like this plot of yarrow here, which is a common prairie flowering plant. What we've done in looking at these 20 plots is to see how productive each of these species is growing by itself, and then comparing it with the plots with 2 species, 4, 8, and so on. And what we see when we look at yarrow, or when we look at the plant over here, this is a monoculture of little blue stem, which is a common prairie grass. What we've seen when we compare these various plots is that there is no monoculture that is as productive as some of our 2-species combination plots. And there are actually no 2-species plots that are as productive as some of our 4-species plots, and that progression continues all the way up to our 24-species plots. Now here's a plot with 12 species in it. This is much more diverse than the monocultures we've looked at, and it's much more productive. Each of the different species we see in these plots is, as I said, doing a different thing. They're filling different roles in here. Some of them are nitrogen-fixing plants. Some of them can grow best during the warm season. Some grow best during the cool times of year. Some of them have deep roots. Some have shallow roots. These differences allow these plants to better exploit the nutrients in this ecosystem and make these 12-species plots much more productive than the monocultures or 2-species plots. Now, when we compare these 12-species plots with 24-species plots, we can detect then the 12-species plot.
David Tillman's research suggests that communities with higher levels of diversity are more productive, more resilient, and more stable than our communities with lower levels of diversity. His work also sheds light on why there is such an enormous diversity of species in the natural world.
One question which has intrigued us is why there are so many species in nature. Why would a little piece of prairie like this be able to have 40 to 80 different species coexisting in it? And the answer to that question provides vital clues into why biodiversity is so important. What we found is that the ability of these species to coexist occurs because each species does something differently. Each one has its own unique role, its own profession, if you will, in this ecosystem. Just like a society is harmed if it loses one profession or another profession. Imagine a society without garbage collectors, or without physicians, or without educators. The same thing happens to an ecosystem. When it loses diversity, it's losing organisms that have a professional role, that do one particular job in that system. When that job isn't done, that system does not function very effectively. When more and more roles are lost, when that system has less and less professional diversity, it functions less and less effectively. When I grew up in Michigan, the whole economy depended upon a single industry, the automobile industry. And that meant that economy had booms and busts when the auto industry did well or did very poorly. States that had more diversified economies, that had more industries, were much more stable. When one industry did poorly, another one was very likely to be doing well. And that ability of one to take up the place of the other when it does poorly is a hallmark of the effects of diversity. The same is true in an ecosystem. In a more diverse ecosystem, when one species does poorly, something else can take its place, take up the unused resources, grow, and take its place. That effect of diversity is a major reason why more diverse ecosystems are more stable. This is an effect which we call the portfolio effect. It's a lot like a portfolio of diversified stocks. If you're investing in the stock market, you're often advised to buy a mutual fund, which owns many different companies. The reason you do that is to hedge your bets. You're getting an insurance value from diversity in your portfolio, just like there's an insurance value from diversity in an ecosystem.
What researchers like David Tillman are discovering is that the best way to ensure the health and productivity of any habitat, whether it be the tall grass prairie in Minnesota, the Chihuahuan Desert in Arizona, or the sagebrush steppe in Idaho, is to preserve as much biological diversity as possible. That means the full community of plants, animals, and microorganisms that comprise those habitats. It is this broad spectrum of living things that helps buffer local economies against such disturbances as fires and floods, droughts and diseases, population shifts and climate change.
Within this dynamic environment, the fortunes of individual species, just as the fortunes of individual companies within the human economy, they'll vary from year to year. You'll have some good years, you'll have a lot of average years, and you'll have some really lean years. But what determines the health of the economy overall, whether we're talking about the natural economy or the human economy, is whether the species and components in it can withstand these natural fluctuations, these ups and downs. So really, the measure that we should use of the health and strength of an economy would concern the amount of diversity in it and its ability, the economy's ability to withstand changes and accommodate these fluctuations that we know will occur in the future.
Without question, human beings are entirely dependent on the health and productivity of natural systems. In a robust economy, nature is able to provide a host of services on which our human well-being depends.
These would range from things like pollination of our crops to pest control. Most pests are controlled naturally. Things like water purification. Most of our water is purified naturally before it comes through our taps. Things like mitigation of floods and droughts. All of these things are provided by natural habitats, and they therefore can be seen as a type of capital, something that, if properly managed over time, will actually yield us a stream of benefits.
It is this natural capital that finances all forms of human economic activity, and it does so continuously. Without the essential goods and services provided by healthy natural systems, our economic prosperity would quickly collapse, and life as we know it would not be possible. When we look closely at the natural world, we see that each species possesses a unique array of skills and aptitudes, and that it holds a distinct place in its community. When we examine the intricate web of life, we notice that all species are truly interdependent, and that biological diversity is a source of strength and stability. And when we contemplate the future of our own species, we realize that the fabric of life is seamless, with the fates of all creatures being inextricably interwoven. To purchase a copy of this program, call Idaho Public Television toll-free at 877-224-7200. The cost is $19.95 for this program and $49.95 for the full 3-part series. For more information about biological diversity, and educational materials available through the Natural Heritage Center. Please visit the website below. Funding for Treasuring Our Natural Heritage has been provided by the National Science Foundation. A presentation of the Natural Heritage Center and Idaho Public Television.